Okay, so we've been working our way through the Bible, kind of from the beginning of the Old Testament, and looking at the different categories, different types of literature in there. And we've made it all the way to the New Testament epistles now, or the letters. Um, Robbie and I were chatting a little earlier about how this is often kind of our favorite section of the Bible because it feels closest to home. The distance between what's talked about there in our own lives seems very short quite often, especially shorter as compared to some of the portions of the Old Testament sometimes. And so this is a portion of the scriptures that we often find ourselves teaching out of frequently, and so hopefully maybe you even already had a chance to teach from one of the letters, and maybe you can draw on that experience to think about it as we talk through a few tips tonight. So let me mention these here. Number one that we talked about as well just a minute ago. Use the phrasing technique described in session 3. So as you are preparing your lesson, make use of that phrasing technique, because this is really the portion of the Bible where that phrasing technique is going to yield the best fruit. Just because that's just kind of the nature of these letters. They build phrase by phrase. They're not stories so much where the story may not necessarily build phrase by phrase. They're letters, and in some cases they're very very tightly written arguments. In some places, especially with the Apostle Paul, he really had a legal mind, and so using the phrasing technique will really be beneficial to you. Now let's review what that was just briefly here. Remember the key step number 1 is, after you've broken down the passage into its individual phrases, then you want to find the one that can stand by itself as a complete sentence, a complete thought. Which phrase can stand as a grammatically complete statement? Because then that allows you to look at the other phrases and you can say, okay, I know they're not here just to give me a grammatically complete statement, because we already have that with this other phrase. So if that's not why this phrase is here, why is it here? What is it adding to the main thought that I've already identified? It's probably clarifying the main thought in some way, or amplifying the main thought, or applying the main thought, or in some way it's going to be enhancing our understanding of what that main thought is. And then again, kind of the technique of it then is to shift that main phrase over to the left side of your paper or your computer screen, whatever you're working with, to kind of get it into that standard outline form that we're all familiar with, right? Where main points go toward the left, subpoints and supporting thoughts start to move toward the right. And we want to visually lay out the phrases that way then. And that'll just, at a glance, give us a good reminder of, oh, okay, here's the main thought of the passage, here are kind of the sub-thoughts. And then you're actually even well on your way toward forming an outline for your lesson once you've done that. So yeah, make use of that phrasing technique. Try it out. If you haven't tried it yet or haven't had a chance to try it, give it a try sometime in your Bible study. It is a very fruitful way to think through a passage. If nothing else, If you feel any degree of confusion or anything about trying to figure out why a certain phrase is there or anything like that, if nothing else, this technique, I should say, forces you to slow down and just take a careful look at the passage, and that alone is valuable. To ensure that you're not just rushing through a passage really quickly. Okay. Number two here. This is an observation that's a real passion of mine. When giving a command, the authors rarely tell us only what to do. They generally also tell us how and why. Make sure to highlight all three. So they rarely tell us only what to do. They generally also tell us how and why. I really think this is one of the most underappreciated gifts that the Bible gives us when it gives us commands. Rarely do we find a command just standing all by itself without any further explanation. Very frequently, in the surrounding context, if a command has been given, we'll receive some kind of information about how we can actually live out that command and why we need to do it, why it's important to live out that command. And those how and why questions are so vital, because if you don't have an answer to those, if you've simply been told to do something, but no one has told you how to do it or why you should do it, chances are you're not going to do it. or if you try, you're just going to be set up for failure more than likely. I mean, just think about it in the context of your own job. Okay, whoever it is that you answer to, if they ask you to do something, but then they give you no guidance about how to do it, you're just going to be in the dark. And even if you set out and try to do it, and even if you kind of figure out a way to do it that seems right to you, you might get feedback from the boss later, and he says, "No, that's not the way to do it." You don't really know if you've done it the right way until you get more feedback, because they never told you how to do it. But more than likely, if nobody tells you how to do it, you probably won't even get started in the first place, because you just don't even know what direction to go in. And then that why question is so vital as well, because if you don't know why you were asked to do something or why you were told to do something, like if you don't know why is this important in the overall goal that we're trying to accomplish, if you don't know the answer to that question, then for one thing, you're not going to know, okay, how hard do I need to work at this? And if I don't get it done, well, how serious is that? Or if I run into struggles or problems, how hard should I try to push through those? Is this task, is it that vital that I've got to get it done no matter what? Or if you don't have that why question answered, then there's just vital information that you don't know. And it is exactly the same in our spiritual lives. If a preacher or a teacher just tells you what to do, is just issuing commands, they never explain how you can actually pull it off or why it's important to follow that command, then you're set up for failure. And I fear that a lot of teaching and preaching tends to gravitate in that direction. where the communicator doesn't necessarily get around to answering those how and why questions, even though they're so important. So, if you are studying a passage in one of the letters, preparing to teach it, and you see a command in there, more than likely, right there in the same context, you're going to see an answer to the how question or an answer to the why question. If it's not right there in the immediate context, then chances are it's probably been answered previously. And that's an important detail I should point out about a lot of these New Testament letters, is that before the author ever gets around to giving commands, he's usually spent a couple of chapters maybe teaching some important theology or correcting some kind of wrong idea that that the audience may have had in mind, that they need to get out of their minds before they can start acting as they should. Almost all of the New Testament letters follow that structure, like teaching first, then commands. Theology and truth first, then application for how we're going to live this out. And so, if you don't see the answer to the how and why question right there in the immediate context, look back at earlier portions of the letter, because it's probably going to be somewhere in there. I'll give you just one example of this from my sermon yesterday. I wasn't even preaching in the New Testament letters, but like I mentioned just a moment ago, teaching this way is one of my passions. It's something that I'm really eager to do this anytime I teach a lesson from the Word. I don't want to just tell people what to do, because if that's all I get across, I really think I've set them up for failure. I want people to understand, here's how you can actually live the way God tells us to live, and here's why we should do it. And so yesterday, if you remember, at one point I was talking about how Elisha responded to the call he received from Elijah, and I was pointing out how a calling from God in our lives has to take priority even over our family ties. So if you remember that section of the sermon there, and I pulled in that quote from Christ where he said that, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he was very strongly emphasizing the need to put our family ties in second place behind our dedication to him. And if you remember, then after that, I pulled in that other quote from Christ about the promise of reward that he gave to his followers. If you remember that, where he said, whoever has left father or mother or sister or brother or son or daughter for my name's sake, he talks about the reward that such sacrifices will be given when he establishes his kingdom. Because I wanted to make clear that that's kind of a question in some ways to both. Well, it's more an answer to the why question there. Okay, I've told you what you need to do. You need to prioritize obedience to God over your family ties. But then we still have the big why question, don't we? Why should I do that? Because that's not an easy thing to do. In fact, that's one of the most challenging decisions we can make in our lives. Because unfortunately, if you come to you come to odds with people in your own family about your faith, and you choose to stay faithful to Christ, and that really ruffles their feathers and puts you in disagreement with them. That's hard. That's extremely hard. And that's one of those life decisions that will probably bring more awkwardness and pain into your life than anything else. And so it's absolutely vital that we know, okay, why should I make that step? And there are actually numerous reasons. I mean, one is just because we need to be faithful to our master. But a second big answer to that why question is because you'll be rewarded for it later on. Because sacrifices made for Christ now will not be overlooked, and they will not go unrewarded forever. Christ promised that we will be rewarded, if we make that painful step of living, at odds with our own family because of our desire to obey Him. So that's why I brought that in at that point, to try to make sure I gave you an answer to why we ought to do that. And yeah, I'll mention. I wasn't sure if I'd mention this. No, I'll go ahead and mention this. One of the reasons why I'm so passionate about trying to answer these questions is, well, for one thing, I want to avoid legalism. And so often, if I, as a preacher or the teacher, if I'm just telling you what to do, then it's really not going to produce healthy spiritual results in your life. Because if we never get beyond talking about what to do, there are going to be so many unanswered questions about, how do I actually pull this off? Or why should I do this? And generally speaking, when you get into legalism, there is no specific why behind the commands that are given. Why should I? Okay, well, I'll go ahead and use this example. Why can't I buy a TV? If that's a standard that's given to me by my church leadership or something, why can't I buy a TV if it's okay for me to buy a smartphone that gives me access to anything that I could see on TV anyway? And the ultimate answer is there is no answer. There is no specific why behind that, except that that's just the standard that was landed on, and it's the standard that you're going to live by if you want to stay in the good graces of those who are giving the standards.
Does that move you from the splash pool to the tidal pool?
What's that?
Does that move you from the splash pool to the tidal pool?
I don't know. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, when you're at the amusement park, the tidal pool makes a big collapsing wave.
Oh, okay.
The splash
Yeah.
pool is small splashes.
Oh, small splash. Oh, okay, sure. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah. Yeah. What the time in my learning where this really just jumped out to me was when I was finishing my Master of Divinity degree, and I had to write a thesis as kind of my final project for that, and I decided to do a comparison between the New Testament and another ancient Christian document that was written about the very same time. In fact, I think it was written while the apostles were still alive. And it was written as basically a discipleship manual for new Christians, specifically people who were preparing for baptism. And so, in that light, a really fascinating document to see. Okay, what were they writing to to help people prepare for being baptized? And it's a document that was probably written by people just like some of the Jewish Christians that we read about some places in the New Testament who were really having a hard time, letting go of the Old Testament law. We read about those folks in a few different letters. They're Christians. They came to faith in Christ, but they were still battling a tendency to be legalistic. And so this document was probably written by folks just like that. We can kind of you can kind of see that as you read it. And the document starts out with just a couple chapters of commandments, just given in like rapid fire fashion. Do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. And yeah, it's just this long list of commandments. And it just struck me as I was doing this comparison how we virtually never see that in the New Testament. We almost never see long stretches of commandments without any further explanation about how to carry out the commandment and why we should live by that commandment. And that just struck me, and I thought, man, this is part of the genius of the New Testament right here. It gives us this well-rounded instruction about how to live, and not just telling us what to do, but how and why also. So okay, well, I've gone on about that long enough. Let's get on to the last one here, number 3. In your preparation to teach from an epistle, read through the entire letter at some point in one sitting. Read through the entire letter at some point in one sitting. That is such a rich practice to go through when you're preparing to teach. And for most of the New Testament letters, they're short enough that it's not that much of a chore to read through the whole thing at one sitting. Especially, quite a few of them are 6 chapters or less. And so, quite a few of them you can read through in 15 minutes. There are about 4 that do become challenging to read through in just one sitting, like Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Hebrews. Those are all, 13 chapters, 14, 15, 16. So, that becomes more challenging to read through that whole thing in just one sitting. But many of them, it's not as bad as it sounds. I know at first it might sound like, whoa, well, that sounds like quite a task, but it's actually not as difficult as it may seem. And the real value in that is you will see themes and points of emphasis in that letter that you otherwise probably wouldn't notice if you were only reading smaller portions at a time. Unless you have a fantastic memory, if you were just reading, one chapter a day or one paragraph a day or something as you were preparing a lesson, you'd probably miss some of those repeated themes in the letter. But if you can sit down and read all of it at once, you are almost surely going to find something that will enlighten your understanding of the passage that you're preparing to talk about. The letters, the New Testament letters, are also my favorite section of the Bible to print out and then just completely mark up those printouts with any observation that jumps out to me, or just as I'm trying to highlight repeated themes or something like that. That's also a rich way to study through a whole New Testament letter. I've been doing that recently with the book of Ephesians, and I enjoy that discipline so much. I made a printout of it for myself, partially because I don't always like to mark up my Bible, so thoroughly that then it's hard to read. Because when I'm preaching or I'm talking to people and I'm teaching, I want to be able to read it fairly easily. So I don't want a lot of stuff kind of in the way. But man, if I print it out, I mark that thing up left to right, up and down. And what I've been doing lately with that printout of Ephesians is I've been doing it a number of days in a row. And each day I have just kind of said, okay, all right, today I'm going to look for today I'm going to look for whenever he mentions Christ, and I'm going to highlight that. And so I did that one day, read through the whole letter, and every time he mentioned like Christ or Lord or Jesus, or even when he used the word him and he was referring to Christ, I highlighted all those. And I got done with that thing, and man, I tell you, those pages are yellow. But that's so helpful then, because at a glance, you just look at that and you say, man, like he could barely get out 10 other words before he mentioned Christ again. It just drives it home in your memory. You think, man, this is all about Christ and the blessings we have through Christ and what Christ has done for us as his people and how we should live as followers of Christ. It's just centered on Christ. So a habit like that, a practice like that can be tremendously helpful as you're preparing. So, okay. Any questions about any of those tips or any thoughts that are on your mind before we wrap things up? Okay, if not, have a good time reading chapter 9 of the book before next week. And then next week will be our final evening together. So next week we'll talk about some tips for teaching from the book of Revelation. And my tip will not be don't do it. Maybe that's your initial thought on teaching from Revelation. Maybe you think, I'll never touch that with a 10-foot pole. But maybe I can give you a few tips that will help you think, oh, well, maybe I could teach a lesson from Revelation sometime. So anyway, that's what we'll talk about next week. So, all right, thanks for being here, everybody.